Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the IGNA Webmaster Series 2020. Today, we have three eminent speakers, Dr. Suresh, Dr. Pradeep, and Dr. Jyoti Sharma, who will be talking all about the antenatal scan anomalies and the role of genetics in pediatric nephrology. Dr. Jyoti Sharma will be moderating the session for the day. Dr. Jyoti Sharma is a consultant pediatric nephrologist at KEM Hospital, Pune. She is also a course director for fellowship program of Development National Board, and she is also a course director for fellowship program of Indian Society of Pediatric Nephrology. She has also been one of my examiner too. She is also a past president of ISPN 2016 to 2017. She is a convener of Pediatric Nephrology chapter of IAP Pune. Her area of interest is voiding disorders. And so over to Jyoti Sharma to introduce the speaker for the day.
Thank you very much, Kalaivani, for your kind introduction. And thank you for having me back on the platform this week. So it's very apt that we discussed urology last session. And this session, we are beginning with imaging, which plays an important part in the diagnosis and follow-up of many diseases of the pediatric urinary tract, including charcot cystic diseases and acquired diseases like calculi. It's often the imaging that offers us a diagnosis or helps to narrow down a diagnosis. And case in point is something a child with hematuria. And though we are traditionally taught that there's glomerular and non-glomerular, it's often the ultrasound when it shows up a calculus, we know which direction to go to. And it's often a combination of two or more complementary modalities which are necessary to arrive at a management strategy. Kalaivani, I'm sorry, there's some disturbance somewhere. Is it audible to everyone?
You're very much audible, ma'am.
There's some disturbance. Okay. So often there is a combination of two or more complementary imaging strategies which may be required to clarify a diagnosis. For example, in a child with a duplex system, the diagnosis is often, initially suspected on ultrasonography. Then you clearly visualize the anomalies on an MRI. And finally, one needs a differential function on DMSA, on a DMSA scan to plan a further strategy. So it is fundamental importance for us not only to know the most appropriate modality for the investigation of a particular patient, but also to understand the risks and benefit associated with each modality, including the deleterious effects of ionizing radiation and the use of IV contrast agents. Finally, because some children will require sedation for an anesthesia for certain investigation like MRE, we need to understand the risks associated with it. With this brief introduction, I would like to know, I have the great honor to introduce Dr. Suresh Seshadri, who is Director of the Mediscan Systems, Chennai, and Honorary Secretary of the Voluntary Health Services. He is a fetal medicine specialist with experience of 38 years, and he has been conferred the FRCOG by the Royal College London in 2010. He has established a specialized twins unit with facilities for fetoscopy and laser for monoporionic twins. His main areas of interest are prenatal diagnosis and fetal therapy. He has been working closely with the NRHM and Tamil Nadu government to train doctors at PhD in an attempt to decrease the burden of birth defects. He is a member of the WHO Southeast Asian Regional Office Expert Group for Birth Defects, Surveillance and Prevention. And with his expertise, he has trained over 4,000 doctors from India and other countries in ultrasound and fetal medicine. Over to you, Dr. Seshadri.
Ma'am, sir has some issues with the speaker. We'll just take up the next speaker as the first one. We can take up Dr. Pradeep Kumar as our first speaker. Is it okay?
Yeah, sure. I mean, whatever you decide. So I think I will introduce Dr. Pradeep? So can I briefly introduce the topic first? So just a brief introduction on why we need to know about genetics and how rapidly genetics has advanced over the last 2 decades. Because from microarray techniques to now whole genome sequencing. So it has not only highlighted how phenotypes correlate with phenotypes, but also has clearly clarified pathophysiology of many disorders. And ultimately, we are moving towards what is known as personalized medicine with the aim of being able to offer therapy which may be gene-based. So this opening up of genetics has really opened up a big opportunity to treat many rare renal disorders, and we are looking forward to listening more about this from Dr. Pradeep Kumar, who is MD in pediatrics and has done a fellowship in clinical genetics. He is head of department of medical genetics at KMCH Hospitals Coimbatore and consultant clinical genetist Genome Medical Center Coimbatore. His specific academic interests are pediatric rare diseases and genetics of cancer. He has many awards and honors for scientific papers presented at various conferences. He's also authored book chapters and articles in publications. He is a national speaker for the Indian Academy of Medical Genetics and Indian Academy of Pediatrics, and an invited state speaker for the IIRI and the OBS and Fetal Medicine Society. So over to you, Dr. Pradeep.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jyoti, for the wonderful introduction about genetics and about me too. And thanks a lot, Dr. Kalaivani, for this wonderful opportunity. My audio is okay?
It's fine. I'm able to hear you well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dr. Kalaivani, for this wonderful opportunity. It's a proud privilege for me to talk in a meet organized by Dr. Nammalwar, my teacher, and sharing a session with my guru, Dr. Suresh. Thanks a lot. So next 30 minutes, I'll be talking about role of genetics in pediatric nephrology. It's a relatively tough job for me because to compile everything, to put it together, it was like almost an off of the nephrology we have to get into. I've tried my level best to give justice to this topic. Let us move on. Yes. Importance of genetics in pediatric nephrology. So I've just split my topic into two major things. So just to make my talk a little easier, one is structural abnormalities, which we can start from the antenatal period, which Dr. Suresh is going to enlighten us about. And after that, the functional disorders of the renal system. So structural, immediately we think of this CACUT, congenital anomalies of kidneys and urinary tract. And various studies have been conducted, and they found this one of the most important of defects, most common one, about 3 to 6% per 1,000 live births. 40 to 50% with chronic kidney diseases had CACUT, and most important, frequent malformation. So we'll just brief upon this CACUT, then move on to the functional abnormalities of the renal system. What are these conditions all about? So whatever we see in antenatal ultrasound, like renal agenesis, hypoplasia, dysplasia, multistic dysplastic kidneys. So all these comes under anomalies of kidney and urinary tract. So what exactly happens and why these disorders happen in these fetuses? First thing is, it is due to the disruption of normal nephrogenesis. So kidney and urinary tract, the development is disrupted. The role can be due to the environment or due to the genes, or maybe some associated multifactorial genetic plus multifactorial, that is called epigenetic mechanisms. So as of now, we always consider most CACUT are sporadic in origin. But again, there are single gene mutations which has been slowly identified with a whole genome sequencing era, and along with syndromic, there are non-syndromic single gene related to CACUT also. But definitely, we need some more evidences to put all these into practice. Environmental is most important is the maternal sugars, what we consider. Other than that, drugs during pregnancy or even alcohol exposure in pregnancy. So this is an environmental abnormality we always consider, particularly maternal sugars we always think of if they present with CACUT. Of course, there are so many syndromes associated with CACUT, so we may not find all the findings in antenatal ultrasounds. Say Alagilli syndrome, you can see cystic kidneys, but again, all other abnormalities may not be evident in the antenatal ultrasound. So same way, Fraser, brachio-otorenal syndrome, they all have various abnormalities which can present mostly postnatally. Maybe they may have renal abnormalities in utero. But the most important thing I want you all to notice, all these disorders have significant recurrence risk. So a CACUT with due to environmental or multifactorial inheritance may not have a significant recurrence risk, but in case if these disorders had recurrence in the next pregnancy, then definitely we have to think in terms of some syndrome which is going on inside. So Fraser syndrome, Kallman syndrome, Meckel-Gruber is one of the common single gene disorder which we see particularly in South India. So it is an autosomal recessive disorder, but most of the autosomal recessive disorder we think consanguinity may play a role. But Meckel-Gruber syndrome is very rampant. There is no need for consanguinity. It's almost there in our community itself. The presentation may be maybe with cystic kidneys with occipital encephalocele. Sometimes it may be confused with neural tube defect. So if in case, if we are not thoroughly examining the kidneys, or if the baby fetus is not subjected to autopsy, we may miss this cystic kidneys. If in case, if it is associated with cystic kidneys and encephalocele, it is not an NTD, neural tube defect. It may be Meckel-Gruber syndrome. What is the difference does it make? Because neural tube defect may not have recurrence risk. You have to take care of the folic acid, the status of the mother, pre-conception, and then maybe you don't expect a recurrence there. But Meckel-Gruber syndrome, being autosomal recessive, can have 25% recurrences. So this shows the significance of phenotypic and genotypic correlation, what exactly is going on during the pregnancy. So this is an important example of what is sporadic and what is single gene disorder. So neural tube defect, sporadic, multifactorial, immediately you can counsel them. The recurrence can be low, provided you take folic acid and B12, take care of your sugars. But Meckel-Gruber syndrome, whatever you do, there is a chance that there can be 25% recurrences. So it shouldn't come as a shock in the next pregnancy for the family. Same way, all other syndromes like Pallister-Hall, Campomelik dysplasia, Townes-Brocks, all these may have associated findings which may not be present always in antenatal period. They may mimic like a CACUT later on with the recurrence, or the babies had abnormalities associated, then we can reclassify as syndromic. So what exactly happened in the genetic mechanism during nephron development? So there are various stages of development, and like ureteric bud induction, mesenchymal to epithelial transition, renal branch morphogenesis, nephron patterning, elongation, all these are signaled by genes. So what does that mean is, whatever abnormality happens, there can be a role of a single gene which is responsible for that particular region to grow. So there are few genes which has been identified for these disorders yet to put into practice. So majority of the causes of CACUT are still unknown, but there are so many studies which have been going on which find single genes related to CACUT. You can see there are various genes each study has reported from various literature. But again, what we know we should understand is, we should understand the interplay of genetic, environmental, and epigenetic factors. So this is very, very important before counseling a family of fetus with CACUT. Majority of CACUT are sporadic. Thus, this we can keep it in our mind, but not always they are sporadic with low recurrence. There can be a recurrence risk even if it is sporadic without a known gene defect, that can be up to 4 to 20%. So at-risk family members, they may have renal abnormalities, may not have a syndromic renal abnormality, but in general, mild renal abnormalities in 10% of the relatives. So next pregnancy options are considered. We should understand whether it is clearly a isolated CACOT or it is associated with syndromic abnormalities. In case if it is a syndrome or we are able to identify a pathogenic mutation, then accordingly the recurrence risk is calculated and prenatal diagnosis has to be offered for these families. Why prenatal diagnosis if in case we are able to identify CACOT all the time during antenatal period is sometimes this may get missed or this may present little late. So we don't want a baby to be born with an abnormality. So the recurrence risk prediction and prenatal diagnosis by chorionic villus sampling or amniocentesis can be offered to them. Pre-implantation genetic is coming up in a big way, and this also can help few patients who are apprehensive of going into the trial and error method. So antenatal ultrasound can be used to detect most renal structural abnormalities, but not always. So this is about CACOT. So say the continuation of CACOT, I will take you through the cystic renal diseases, which can present antenatally and also can present little postnatally or later in antenatal period also. The common one is autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease can be associated with hepatic involvement too. They present with oligohydramnias. Because of that, pulmonary hypoplasia, respiratory distress, bilateral flank mosses, Potter sequence we can see in these babies. Renal function usually impaired, but maybe initially normal in 20 to 30% of the patient, even postnatally. So 50% of the patient with neonatal perinatal presentation developed ESRD by the age of 10 years. So it means this is a progressive disorder and it results in end-stage renal disease very soon. So varied presentation is the key here because autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease, most of us think that they may present very early in the pregnancy. It is sure that we can identify by antenatal ultrasound. It is not the case here because we have seen so many families present little late at 28 weeks, even at 32 weeks, even postnatally, the babies start developing the cysts. So what does that mean is you cannot always detect less than 20 weeks. Sometimes it may present late also. So that shows the importance of genetic evaluation of these families. Because of genetic evaluation, if we do completely, then only we can plan prenatal diagnosis and then we can tell them for sure that this baby is affected or unaffected. So value of checking a single gene disorder in ARPKD is very, very important because of the varied presentation. So the liver abnormalities can be presented, it can present as liver abnormalities later in the life. I'll take you through a family. They are non-consanguineous parents. So autosomal recessive, we always think of consanguinity, but again here, parents are non-consanguineous. First baby diagnosed at 36 weeks as polycystic kidney disease. Baby died in 5 days. No prenatal diagnosis attempted. They proceeded with the second pregnancy without genetic evaluation. Again, oligohydramnias and polycystic kidneys were noted at 32 weeks. So what does that mean is, even though we know that there is a high risk for polycystic kidneys, they would have attempted in looking for polycystic kidneys, but the presentation was at 32 weeks only. Fetus showed features suggestive of ARPKD. Postnatally, baby died in a month due to renal failure. So there is a recurrence, particularly the 25% recurrence has happened, and this baby has not survived because of ARPKD. If in case, if would have done genetic evaluation in the first pregnancy itself, in the first baby itself, we would have prevented this baby being born and died later in life. So genetic analysis were conducted for this particular baby, and there were 2 variations identified. So what does that mean is, in PKHD1 gene, 2 mutations are identified, as exactly we expect in a non-consanguineous parents. Various mutations, this is called a compound heterozygous state, and this was confirmed in the parents, and this family is now ready for next pregnancy because they can do prenatal analysis by chorionic villus sampling or amniocentesis at 13 or 16 weeks respectively, so that we can ensure them that the baby is normal or having ARPKD early in gestation. They can take decisions accordingly. So this is how we have to evaluate this particular family. So cyst formation, this is autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease. So this again, we always say it is adult polycystic kidney disease because of the presentation may be relatively late, and it is not so fast in progression also. There may be multi-system involvement also. The genes involved are PKD1 and PKD2. So the severity of the clinical manifestations or highly variable because this is an autosomal dominant condition. Autosomal recessive, also there may be serious manifestations, but autosomal dominant, the manifestations can be highly variable inside the family also. So adult can present at 40 years of age with CIS. The same family and other sibling can present little early at 30 years, or somebody else in the family can present at 50 years or 60 years. This is a typical pattern of varied expressivity in the autosomal dominant pattern. So we know that this can happen late or early, but that depends on the presentation of the individual. So although symptomatic ADPKD is common in 4th or 5th decade, there may be other symptoms also. So most often it can be an accidental finding. What are all the clinical scenario we meet? Suddenly they would have gone for pain abdomen, or an ultrasound would have been done, and it can be an accidental finding, or there may be a positive family history of renal failure, and otherwise few families have presented with, during routine antenatal checkup, the mother was fetal scans were done. They accidentally found out that mother had cystic kidneys. So the clinical presentation and prognosis is very much variable. Index case mutation analysis is important because unless you find out this, you may not know the recurrence, because the recurrence is very high, 50%. So prenatal diagnosis is strongly recommended here also. So some may argue that it presents late, maybe in the later adult life, but there are patients who present very early. We don't want their families to get this, and we are authorized to do prenatal diagnosis in this setting also. So nephronophthisis is one of the autosomal recessive disorder, can present as cystic abnormalities, may be associated with other syndromes like Senior-Loken, Joubert, depending on the associated abnormalities. This is an autosomal recessive disorder, 25% recurrence risk is there. So what are other cystic renal diseases which can present as renal cyst, but they may have other multisystem involvement like Joubert syndrome. We always know the cerebellar hypoplasia, Bardet-Biedl syndrome. They have eye abnormalities, cystic kidneys, polycystic kidney disease, and all these are autosomal recessive. So 25% recurrence risk is there. Same as ARPKD, we have to evaluate these families to look for recurrence risk. So all other abnormalities have given oral facial digital syndrome, June syndrome, asphyxiating thoracic dystrophy, presence as skeletal dysplasia, but they may have cysts also. Zellweger syndrome, cerebrohepatorenal abnormality, tuberous sclerosis. The presentation may be different, but they tend to have renal cysts too. So von Hippel-Lindau syndrome also. So all these are autosomal dominant disorder with 50% recurrences. Again, recurrence can be predicted only based on the genetic evaluation of the index child. So a child with non-consanguineous parents presented with clinical indication of round face, obesity, polydactyly, and ambiguous genitalia. So the clinical picture is typical of Bardet-Biedl syndrome, and we found out that mutation. And if this mutation is found out clearly, a pathogenic mutation, almost your work is done, because it is easy to pick up the same in the next pregnancy so that you can avoid a baby being born with the same disorder. So management of index child and recurrence prevention in the next pregnancy can be attempted based on the genetic evaluation. So I'll just move on to a few other symptoms which the patients present, and accordingly the genetic disorders, what we have to think in terms of. Most of the syndromes I'll just enumerate and go because want of time. So hematuria, Alport syndrome, thin basement membrane disease, FSGS, some cases of MPGN can have genetic background. Sickle cell granulopathy, one of the systemic disease which have so many new nephrological presentations, crystalluria, cystic renal disorders, tumors, hereditary thrombotic microangiopathies, atypical HUS, idiopathic hypercalciuria. So genetic disorders associated with proteinuria. The common one is Alport syndrome, tubular disorders, other system disorders presenting with nephro problems, cystinosis, Wilson disease, Lowe syndrome, Den syndrome, galactosemia, polycystic kidney disease already we have discussed. So a baby being born to non-consanguineous couple, maternal uncle died of renal failure at 56 years. Transplantation done, but he died later, transplantation failure. This person is a person who presented at 39 years, was evaluated for pedal edema. He was found to have proteinuria. He progressed to renal failure. on dialysis now. The renal biopsy showed amyloidosis. So then we did genetic analysis for this particular person, and we found a pathogenic mutation causing apolipoprotein A2 deficiency, and this should be the reason for his abnormality. And we have another example in his family too, with a LV renal failure, and the renal transplantation has failed. Now the question, the confusion is whether this person needs only renal transplantation or liver transplantation also has to be done, because it is apolipoprotein A2 deficiency, the problem. Unless you sort out in the liver, this is the dilemma we are undergoing with this patient, and we may sort it out soon for this particular patient. Extended family member testing is very, very important in this family. We know it is autosomal dominant, and one pathogenic heterozygous mutation is found. So extended family member search is this person's sister, we searched for the mutation, and the results are awaited. So if she is also affected, we may need to follow her up before she goes in for end-stage renal disease. So this is about a patient with amyloidosis presenting with renal failure. So inherited proteinuria and nephrotic syndrome, the common one is your congenital nephrotic syndrome. Other than that, there are so many other conditions with multiple genes involved, associated with renal anomalies only or associated with multi-system involvement. So purely all these depends upon the findings we have during presentation. Sometimes these presentation can be only proteinuria. Later on, all other multi-organ involvement can happen. So in the nephrology unit, the presentation will be because like a proteinuria condition, but later on it may evolve into a multi-system syndromic disease. So common syndromes I've mentioned here. So most important I've highlighted is the Fabry disease. The presentation may be in the adolescent, but one important thing we have to notice, treatment is available for Fabry's disease. Enzyme replacement therapy is available for Fabry's disease. So it is a completely treatable disorder if it is identified early and proven genetically. So another case scenario, third degree consanguineous parents, baby was born, first baby, normal till 15 days, developed swelling of limbs, generalized edema. Initially, the suspicion immediately for a neonatologist or a pediatrician will be that of torch infections, all other infections. But again, we found that the proteinuria is very, very high, and the genetic analysis showed that it is congenital nephrotic syndrome. So the baby is under follow-up, but again, what is more successful is we have found out a mutation in this baby. Even if the prognosis is poor for this baby, the parents can attempt the next pregnancy based on this report, so that we can do the mutation analysis in utero itself. If in case if this step is missed, then imagine they have a risk of getting the same type of abnormality in the next baby, about 25%. And again, the prognosis is very, very bad. So what we have to do is, if we cannot treat something, do a genetic diagnosis, attempt preventing the same in the next pregnancy. Hypercalciuric condition or the next in my list, and maybe associated with tubular dysfunctions, Fanconi syndrome, Williams syndrome, which is a surprise for me too. It can present with hypercalciuria because we know the reason: distal renal tubular acidosis, Barter's disease, and Dent disease. So another family who presented with, it is a third degree consanguineous couple. So one child died in paternal cousin side, similar consanguinity. So first child died in 2.5 years of age, presented with anemia, shrunken kidneys. They went for anemia, paleness, evaluated. That time itself, baby had shrunken kidneys, end-stage renal disease, died very soon. And the second baby, this baby is an index child. Without any genetic evaluation, they have proceeded with the next pregnancy. And this baby was normal till 13 months. Now we evaluated was for polyuria. Ultrasound shows bilateral extensive medullary calcinosis. So what does it mean is, this is an autosomal recessive nephrocalcinosis, which has occurred in this family. The first baby died within 2-3 years, and this baby also presented. We don't know what the prognosis will be. This could have been prevented if we would have attempted a genetic evaluation in the first baby itself. So plan is to do genetic evaluation, genes related to autosomal recessive nephrocalcinosis by next generation sequencing, management prevention option based on the genotype. Results, we are yet to receive it. So thrombotic microangiopathy, again, have genetic basis. So many genetic reasons are there. So all this has to be thought of during evaluation too. So focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, well known, associated with genetic involvement. So finding out this and ruling out a genetic background is important for management and prevention of these cases. Alport syndrome, they usually presents with either with proteinuria. They may have associated sensorineural hearing loss, 90% of the males, 10% of the females, and there may be ophthalmologic findings. And we expect end-stage renal disease in 10 to 30% of the patients. Intrafamilial variation is very, very important because it can present in different forms. And there are so many different inheritance, X-linked recessive, autosomal recessive, or dominant. Again, if an Alport syndrome patient is there and you try to prevent the same in the next pregnancy by genetic evaluation also. So one family, they were siblings. Sister was evaluated for generalized tiredness. On evaluation, she was found to have bicytopenia, sensorineural hearing loss, poor vision. Her brother had hematuria at 15 years, have hearing loss. So we have done next generation sequencing, including all the genes involved with this presentation, and we are awaiting these results. So sickle cell nephropathy is a systemic disorder which can have so many nephrological pointers. So renal manifestations are due to the microthrombosis during sickling crisis, secondary to sickling in the relatively hypoxic, acidic, and hypertonic renal medulla. So it can be precipitated by various factors, and all the presentation can be like that of a renal disease, but again, unless we analyze them, we cannot find out this sickle cell nephropathy. This again has 25% recurrences. It is rampant disease in our belt, particularly in Ooty and Ooty regions. Hemoglobin HBB gene is the gene involved, and 25% recurrence risk is there. Unless we find out this, we cannot prevent in the next pregnancy. So next topic is about polyuric conditions, genetic disorders, Bartter's, Gittleman, and nephrogenic diabetes mellitus. These are the three which I'm going to concentrate upon. So they present in antenatally as polyhydramnias. Obviously, polyuria is the reason. Children born will have polydipsia, always thirsty, hypercalciuria, nephrocalcinosis, and renal failure can occur in rare situations. So there are various presentations, neonatal presentation, classic presentation with and associated with sensorineural hearing loss, nephrocalcinosis, all these. So what we do is we do a phenotypic list. What are all the findings and what will be the most likely gene involved amongst all these? Anyhow, looking for single gene may not be beneficial financially nowadays because of the next generation sequencing. At once, we can go ahead with doing all these because even the phenotype, genotype, little mismatch is there, can be covered up by next generation sequencing panel testing. So there can be autosomal dominant or recessive inheritance. So the recurrence can be even up to 50%. So Gittleman syndrome can present little late, but presentation can be similar like polyuria, hypokalemia, alkalosis. To prevent this, we need to know the mutation. We have to identify the mutation here. 2 genes involved, and these genes has to be sequenced. So nephrogenic diabetic insipidus presents with polyuria, polydipsia, poor feeding, failure to thrive, and then dehydration too. So all these are genetic disorders which has to be identified in gene level and tried prevented in the next pregnancy in these families. So nephrogenic diabetes insipidus presents with polyuria, polydipsia. The 2 genes involved, one is this AVPR2, X-linked recessive. That means male children can be affected and females will be carriers. And there are 10% of the cases it can be autosomal recessive. That means it can happen even in a male or female baby. The 25% recurrence risk is there depending on the gene which is involved. So 4-year-old male child born to 3rd degree consanguineous couple. He had polyuria, polydipsia, poor feeds, failure to thrive. Blood sugar levels were normal. Already these children were evaluated by nephrologists and were referred to us. So his mother is pregnant now with 8 weeks of gestation, and this child has not undergone any genetic evaluation. So as of now, we know if it is X-linked, the recurrence can be depending on the sex of the baby. If it is male, 50% of the males can be affected. If it is autosomal recessive, 25% of the babies can be affected, whether it is male or female. So now no genetic evaluation has been done. So what we did was we attempted doing this genetic evaluation. We found a mutation in AVPR2 gene. That means it is X-linked recessive inheritance. So the prenatal diagnosis, amniocentesis was done, and fetus was found to be normal. So if in case the baby is affected, the result, we will counsel the families regarding the result, and most of the time they won't continue the pregnancy, and that option will be there if we do this testing successfully in the index child and the fetus. Another family, a consanguineously married couple, they presented with their first pregnancy was a preterm delivery due to polyhydramnios. So the previous case I discussed was a success story where we did everything and baby was found to be normal. But this family is relatively unfortunate because that baby, the first baby, preterm delivery due to polyhydramnios, died in the neonatal period, evaluated in NICU, suspected to have Bartter's. But again, diagnosis was not confirmed genetically. So without genetic diagnosis, they proceeded with the second pregnancy. And again, this is a twin pregnancy with polyhydramnios, which started little late in pregnancy. Again, no genetic evaluation could be attempted because of the late presentation. And then they presented with at 18 weeks of pregnancy, the next pregnancy too. So the difficulties here are presenting at 18 weeks of pregnancy with previous abnormalities, without any genetic evaluation. We are put in a situation where we cannot do anything. We know it is unfortunate, there is a recurrences, we cannot do anything for these families. Only thing is genetic evaluation has to be done prior to next pregnancy, particularly in the index child. Then they can go ahead with pregnancy to prevent these disorders to happen again. So renal tubular acidosis, primary Fanconi syndrome is one, and most of the time they can present with secondary abnormality of any other systemic illnesses like cystinosis, tyrosinemia, galactosemia, Wilson's disease, so even Marfan syndrome, Ehlers-Danlos, sickle cell. So there is a whole lot of syndromes can cause renal tubular acidosis, but for a nephrologist, the child may present only with renal tubular nephrosis now. Later on, all other symptoms can start developing. So a child who presented with developmental delay, cataract, he had seizures, involuntary movements, and then landed to nephrologist. He found out that there is a feature suggestive of distal RTA, proteinuria. So dysmorphism, he had dolichocephaly, arched eyebrows, epicanthic folds, nystagmus, dystrophic teeth. So all these are features which are pointing towards one disorder called Lowy syndrome. OCRL gene sequencing was done for this child. And again, this is an abnormality which has recurrences, and this can be prevented based on the genetic mutation of this child. Another person who was born of consanguineous couple presented with clinical indications of developmental delay, that is more of motor, abdominal distension, short stature, hypophosphatemic rickets. So lab analysis showed glucosuria, proteinuria, hypertriglyceridemia. She was suspected to be affected with primary Fanconi syndrome, renal tubular acidosis, or secondary Fanconi syndrome, and evaluated for pathogenic variations. We did genetic evaluation. Thinking all these in mind, we listed out all the differential diagnosis, listed out all the genes which can give rise to this one, and we found out a mutation which is responsible for Fanconi-Bickel syndrome. So this is an abnormality which can be treated, diet management with supplementations. We can manage a child a bit, and then we found out a mutation. This can be prevented in the next pregnancy in the family. So we can, another 2 more slides. Let us know about the concepts of genetic evaluation, not only in pediatric nephrology, generally. So genetic spectrum of pediatric nephrology is clinically and genetically it is heterogeneous because it can present as kidney disease. Later on, it can evolve into a systemic disease. This is a part of it. Or a systemic disease can start and then kidneys start involving. So presentations can vary depending on the pathology and the genetic etiology also. Most importantly, the syndrome will not behave similarly in the family or in the relative side also. The same mutation can behave in a different way depending on the severity. A systemic disorder may present as nephrological disorder or vice versa. So constant follow-up of these families is very important to clinch the exact diagnosis in evolving disorders. So what are the clues we have to think of in case of think of genetic disorders? One is a strong family history. Somebody else had similar illness, then definitely is a genetic disorder. We have to probe into these genes. So history of strong consanguinity, recurrence in anywhere, we have to look into the patient think of genetic disorder and start evaluating. Multi-organ involvement, obviously, we know it should be a part of a multi-system involvement. And unusual pathology or course of the disease, it is not behaving as we expected. Definitely think of genetic etiology. So what are all the evaluation steps? First is once you do the genetic evaluation, you are clinching the diagnosis unquestionably. So they go to another center, nobody is going to question the diagnosis because it is there as a genetic diagnosis itself. It gives better insights about the disorder. You know how to manage the patient now, you know how to manage the patient in the future also. Anticipatory guidance, constant search for secondary complications which are expected for this particular mutation can help that family not getting into these complications or treated early so that the quality of life is good for these families. Prognostication and appropriate management of that index child is very, very important as a nephrologist point of view. These disorders have significant recurrences. So at least to avoid recurrence in next pregnancy, next generation, genetic etiology has to be named. Particularly, it has to start from the index patient, the affected person. So fixing the genetic mutation based on all your phenotypic list and recurrence risk prediction based on parental screening. If in case parents are not carriers, this can be a de novo mutation which has happened only in the child. They may not have the recurrence also. If in case at-risk family members are there, the siblings can be identified. They can be screened for the complications in this index child if they are having the same mutation, and they can be managed appropriately. So prevention by prenatal diagnosis or pre-implantation diagnosis in next pregnancy is very, very important because these disorders, whatever I've listed or dreaded, they have a significant complication. They will affect the quality of life of the child and also the family to a great extent. So this is the only way to prevent these disorders in these families. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pradeep, for this very exhaustive talk on genetics in pediatric nephrology and for the very interesting case discussion. We will come back to you after the imaging session with questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Over to Dr. Suresh. We'll request you to start your talk. We are looking forward to listening to you about the role of imaging in pediatric nephrology.
Okay, good evening. Are you able to see my slides?
Yes, sir.
Hear me? Okay.
Yes, sir, very much.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Dr. Kalevani, Dr. Malwar, and Dr. Jyoti Sharma for inviting me for giving this lecture and also participating in this webinar series. So what I'm going to do, we have heard about the genotypic problem in pediatric nephrology and also urology. What I'm going to take you through is some of the aspects of ultrasound in prenatal and postnatal evaluation of this baby, because increasingly we find that patients who are having antenatal ultrasound, when we find out an anomaly on the ultrasound, they would like to have further information about what's going to happen to the kidney, short term and long term. And naturally, the subspecialist is called, and fetal medicine as a specialty has evolved in such a way that the entire gamut of product, we have a pediatric cardiologist, pediatric nephrologist, pediatric urologist, all of them participating during antenatal care. So let me take you through some of the aspects which are relevant to day-to-day clinical practice. Now, congenital anomalies of the kidney and urinary tract, as we know, are embryonic disorders, and they are a spectrum of defects. And if you go by the embryological timing, we find that renal athenesis really happens by the 4th week. So by that time, it is decided that the baby's kidneys are not going to be there. And subsequently, as you look at the timelines, by about the 7th or 8th week, the decision on postnatal guard is made. Whereas renal hypoplasia and the nephron number on renal dysplasia can go on throughout the pregnancy at beyond 36 weeks and also even after birth. So let's look at how with ultrasound, how the normal kidneys look like. We always try to evaluate the kidneys in two planes. One is this, the sagittal plane and also the transverse plane. The transverse plane is very, very important because this is going to tell us about renal obstructions. So the renal outline and also the renal pelvis are important. And the renal length is equal to the gestational age in weeks. And when the renal length is less than the fifth centile for gestational age, it's considered as a small kidney. Now, the fetal bladder can be seen very, very early as 10 weeks. And you see it in the lower abdomen, and we should image it in all fetuses right from 10 weeks onwards. And it's important to know that bladder filling and emptying.
Excuse me, sir. Sorry to interrupt. Can you be a bit louder, sir? You're not all audible.
Okay. Is it better now? Is it better
Yeah,
now?
now it's better. Yeah,
Okay.
it is better, sir.
So the indices of renal function are, one is bladder filling and emptying in the fetus, and also the amount of liquor, especially from the second trimester onwards. If you have good liquor, we know the baby has at least one functioning kidney. Now, as I told you about the assessment of renal pelvis, which is extremely important in the transverse section, between 16 to 27 weeks, the anteroposterior diameter of the renal pelvis less than 7 millimeters is considered as normal, and between 28 to 40 weeks, less than 10 millimeters is considered as normal. It's also important to note that we should not measure the kidneys in the coronal sections because that will give false impression and false diagnosis. Now, as early as 10 weeks, especially between the 11 to 14 week scan, the first trimester, we can identify the kidneys and the bladder very distinctly. But to remember that at this point of time, the liquor is contributed by the membrane and less contribution from renal function. So as you come into the second trimester from 15 weeks onwards, contribution of liquor from the urine production is very, very significant. Now let's look at some abnormalities. We can look at abnormalities of kidney renal number, where there's failure of formation of the kidneys and outflow systems, like renal agenesis can be unilateral or bilateral. As we know, bilateral renal agenesis is always lethal, whereas unilateral renal agenesis can continue, and we will see what are the implications as we go by. Now, when we look at abnormalities of size and morphology, we look at hypoplasia, dysplasia, and also multicystic dysplastic kidneys. And when you come to kidney position, we need to understand the implications of low place kidney, horseshoe kidney, and ectopic kidney, because the renal ascent starts by 6 weeks. And when you come to outflow abnormalities like PUJ, ureteroceles, megaureters, vesicoureteric reflux, post-urethral valves, and urethral atresias, we need to not only identify them, also know how to address them in the immediate post-natal period. Let's take first bilateral renal agenesis. It's really almost a 100% diagnosis between 11 to 14 weeks. When you see anhydramnios beyond 15 weeks, there's absent bladder, empty renal foci, and there's no renal arteries on color Doppler. We always look for associated abnormalities, and this is, of course, bilateral renal agenesis. But what is important is when there is unilateral renal agenesis, where one kidney is seen and one renal artery is seen, the other side kidney is absent, we look for other system abnormalities, like the vertebral system, the cardiac. It could be part of a VACTEL association, or simply this kidney is not in its location, could be seen in the pelvis, like for example, it could be a pelvic kidney. But what are the clinical implications of a single kidney, which is of importance to us? We find in almost 90% of them, there is compensating hypertrophy of the other kidney. But also, when there's a prolonged increase in the size and nephron number, because of the solitary functioning kidney, the other kidney, the number of nephrons increases, the size of the nephrons increases, there is glomerular hyperfiltration, which can, over a period of time, lead to glomerular sclerosis, renal mass reduction, with decrease in nephron number. So it sort of, it goes to a point and starts a vicious circle by itself. So it can result in renal injury, hypertension, proteinuria, decline in GFR over a period of time. So while we believe that one kidney is enough for functioning, of course, yes, there are many patients where we've identified a single kidney later on in life, but there's potentially also problems for a single kidney, which can be associated with other congenital anomalies of the kidney and urinary tract, and also later on renal injury. A systematic review of unilateral renal agencies by Westland showed that 32% have associated other anomalies of the kidney and urinary tract, and 20% will have at least one marker of renal injury like hypertension, microalbuminuria, and reduced GFR, and this has implications for prenatal counseling. Now, in our own series of 299 cases, we found that in 60%, the unilateral renal agencies was isolated, but there was associated anomalies in over 40% of them. Most of them were diagnosed in the second and third trimester and can be diagnosed quite late. Now, what about positional fusion abnormalities? We look at three signs: empty renal fossa, abnormal angle of the renal pelvis, and abnormal origin and course of the renal vessels. So 42% association with other congenital anomalies and also chromosomal abnormalities when there are positional fusion abnormalities. So let's look at pelvic kidney. Now, pelvic kidney diagnosis is a challenge, but we can we can identify a sign which we call as the abdominal aorta branching angle, where the normal abdominal aorta branches into iliac arteries. The normal angle is less than 55 degrees. But when there is an increased angle, you find the pelvic kidney is usually seen right in the middle there, as you can see in the postmortem picture, which causes increase of the abdominal aorta bifurcation angle. Now, kidneys can also be found in other locations. This was one of our publications in 2007, where we found both the kidneys in the thorax of the fetus. And here you can see both renal arteries facing upwards towards the thorax. Now, horseshoe kidneys can be very difficult to identify antenatally, requires a bit of expertise, but if you can carefully trace the renal outline, horseshoe kidneys can indeed be identified. Our earliest diagnosis was done about 12 to 13 weeks. But we can also look at the renal pelvis angle, and a lower pole fusion is seen in almost 95% of them, and that's why the renal pelvis angle will be altered in horseshoe kidneys. But the most important information for us is while horseshoe kidney can potentially be missed, there are other associated abnormalities which needs to be identified for proper counseling of the patient. Now, let's look at the most important thing now. We have come to not only size and morphology, many of these pregnancies will be terminated. It may not reach the pediatric nephrologist at all. But when you have kidneys which are cystic or echogenic in nature, then there are potential implications for renal function. So the terminology is hypoplastic. Kidneys are given for small kidneys with normal architecture, and dysplastic terminology is used when kidneys are small with echogenic with cysts. So here you can see a multicystic dysplastic kidney, which can be unilateral or bilateral, where you can see large cysts which are there. Now, here are echogenic kidneys, where you can see cortex is bright and echogenic. The medullary pyramids are well seen. And here also echogenic kidneys, but the medullary pyramids are completely not seen at all. Now, this could be a normal variant. The size could be small or large, or it could be a pointer to hereditary cystic diseases like autosomal dominant polycystic kidneys or recessive polycystic kidneys or congenital nephrotic syndromes. Now, let's look at one type of echogenic kidneys. So this patient came at 23 weeks. The liquor was absolutely normal, but the kidneys were enlarged and echogenic, and the autopsy also shows enlarged echogenic kidneys. And when you look at the maternal kidneys, the mother had bilateral polycystic kidneys. So obviously,
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, but can you move the mic closer to your mouth because there is an echo which is coming throughout the talk. Thank you.
Uh, is it better now? Is it
Uh,
better now?
just keep it a little closer, please.
Okay, is it better?
Yes, thank you. It is.
It is better. When you move your mic little away from your mouth, it's better, sir.
Okay. Okay, this should be all right now.
Yeah, this is fine, sir.
Okay. So this mother, because the mother had autosomal dominant polycystic kidneys, so this renal histology also demonstrated autosomal dominant polycystic kidneys. Of course, now we can do genetic testing by looking for the PKD1 gene, and we could do early diagnosis in the next pregnancy. Now, the second type of echogenic kidneys is the autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease, which also enlarge echogenic and small cysts are seen. They are always bilateral, associated with hepatic fibrosis and oligohydramnios. Of course, this has very poor prognosis, and pregnancy generally is not continuous. But the third type, here you can see the first baby for the mother died at 12 days of renal failure. And so second pregnancy, she came to us, and you can see bilateral echogenic kidneys. Neonatal death occurred again, and so the parents were extremely worried, and but they did not do any particular testing. But when she came to the third pregnancy, she came at 20 weeks, and again you can see bilateral echogenic kidneys. Very unfortunate. And this time they said we should give the fetus for autopsy, and we should do the investigations. And the autopsy actually showed that the final diagnosis was congenital nephrotic syndrome, Finnish type of nephrosis. So this was autosomal recessive. We could do a genetic evaluation for them and then help them through in the subsequent pregnancy. Now, here's another type of echogenic kidneys where at 20 weeks, this baby had echogenic kidneys but absolutely normal liker. And this is where we are at a loss to see what is to be done. So this patient had a full-term normal delivery, 3.1 kg. The neonatal scan was absolutely normal. The baby is alive and healthy. So this is where a catch-22 situation, how to counsel the patient. It's an echogenic kidney. Some of them turn out to be abnormal. Some of them turn out to be good. But here, one of the important things to be looked for is the renal architecture, the preservation of the medullary pyramid, the preservation of the size of the kidney, and the normal liker tells us that we could give this baby a chance to be a normal variant. Now, cystic renal dysplasias could be syndromic, where you can see a cystic kidneys, encephalopathy, and polydactyly, which is Meckel-Gruber syndrome. This is autosomal recessive, and of course, the pregnancies go for termination. Now, but the other important thing for us is when there's cystic renal dysplasia due to obstructive causes, lower urinary tract obstruction, cystic changes in the kidney due to obstructive dysplastic changes, they become non-functioning kidneys. Here you can see what looks like polycystic kidneys, but here you can see a very large bladder, which also quite trabeculated inside, and this is the result of a long-standing obstruction leading to renal cysts. And that was the autopsy finding, which shows you a very thick bladder wall, telling you that this is an obstructive dysplasia. So let's summarize by looking at echogenic kidneys. We look for size, corticomedullary differentiation, and liker. If it's normal size, normal corticomedullary differentiation, normal liker could be a normal variant. If it is a normal, if it's normal or small size, with or without corticomedullary differentiation, it could be cystic renal dysplasia and nephrotic syndrome, or if it is large size, we could have associated anomalies when it's a syndromic etiology, and there are no associated abnormalities or cystic renal diseases. You have preserved or increased corticomedullary differentiation with normal liker, it is autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease, or when there's a loss of CMD and oligohydramnion, it is ARPKD or cystic renal dysplasia. So there's some algorithmic approach which you can have. Lastly, I'll come to fetal obstructive uropathy. Today, the term obstructive uropathy has given to a new terminology, which we call as urinary tract dilatation. Now, we've said almost 80% of renal dilatations in pregnancy is physiological or transient. So then you could have obstructive pathology or could have indeterminate etiology. The most important thing to know is dilatation is not always and dilatation is always a dynamic process. If there is obstruction, the kidneys will continue to, the renal pelvis will continue to dilate over a period of time. So serial evaluations will become mandatory. So we need to standardize on nomenclature. And a lot of ultrasound terminologies have evolved, like hydronephrosis, pilectasis, pelviectasis, uronephrosis, hydrouronephrosis, pelvic full nephron, and so forth. Now, all these terminologies have given rise to a very simple technology called urinary tract dilatation. And antenatally, this urinary tract dilatation, we just classify them as A1 or A2 and 3. Let me tell you what this is. The criteria used for urinary tract dilatation is AP diameter of renal pelvis, the extent of the calyceal dilatation, parenchymal abnormalities, bladder and ureteral abnormalities, and amniotic fluid volume, and associated abnormalities like vertebral, anorectal, cardiac, and others. So the classification of urinary tract dilatation in the antenatal period, because this has an extensive implication for the postnatal evaluation of these babies. So in the antenatal period between 16 to 27 weeks, the renal pelvis diameter, it is 4 or less than 7 millimeters, between 4 and 7 millimeters, with central or no calyceal dilatation. All others are normal. It is called as UTD A1 or low risk. Beyond 28 weeks, if the anteroposterior renal diameter is 7 to less than 10 millimeters, with again no calyceal dilatation, it is called as UTD A1 or low risk. But when the renal pelvis is more than 7 millimeters, there is peripheral calyceal dilatation, parenchymal thickness is abnormal, parenchymal appearance is abnormal, ureters are abnormal, bladder is abnormal, unexplained oligohydramnios, or when greater than 28 weeks when the renal pelvis is greater than 10 millimeters, it is classified as A2 and A3. A2, A3 is just a common terminology which is used. The reason why it is given that is it is correlated with the postnatal terminology, which I'll just tell you. Now, what is the postnatal risk for these babies? If the severity is mild, that is in the second trimester is between 4 and less than 7 millimeters or less than 10 millimeters in the third trimester, the risk of postnatal pathology is only 11.9%. Whereas if it is severe, greater than 10 millimeters, and third trimester is greater than 15 millimeters, the AP diameter of the renal pelvis, there is an 88% chance of postnatal pathology. So the exceptions here are vesicouretic reflux and distal ureteral obstruction. So what is the natural history? When you see a pelvis dilatation, it may regress. As I told you in A1, regression can happen. It may remain static, which is again in A1, but can progress. A1 can progress to A2, A3, or most cases of A2, A3 will progress over a period of time, and renal dysplasia can occur in severe cases. So the time of presentation decides the prognosis. In the first trimester, if you see significant dilatation, this baby is likely to have a poorer prognosis. In the second trimester, if it happens in the second trimester, the A1 resolves in about 80% of the favorable prognosis. In the third trimester, higher rates of postnatal confirmed pathology needing surgical treatment. The postnatal evaluation is extremely important to understand that you should delay the postnatal examination by at least 48 hours. We should not rush in and do an examination of the kidney immediately because some kind of the fluid volume adjustment is happening in the baby, and the full blown picture will be seen only after 48 hours. But except in cases where there's and concerns about patient compliance with postnatal evaluation. Now, children with prenatal urinary tract dilatation, a second postnatal ultrasound should be performed even if the first postnatal ultrasound is normal. So let's look at some timings. The timings are the follow-up scans. In a UTD A1, which we said, in the prenatal period, one additional scan is done at 32 weeks or beyond. After birth, 2 additional ultrasound, 48 hours to 1 month, and another ultrasound 1 to 6 months later. The others are aneuploidy risk if modification is required. Now here, UTD A1, if ultrasound is normal, in the 32-week scan, no prenatal or postnatal follow-up is necessary. But if there's persistent UTD A1, you need to do evaluation after birth. But when you go to UTD A2 and 3, in the prenatal period, we follow 4 to 6 weekly intervals. But after birth, after 48 hours to 1 month of age, and other scans to be done in consultation with the pediatric nephrologist. So here, follow-up scans in 4 to 6 weeks, recommendation for subsequent assessment or the discretion of the clinician, depending on the renal function of the baby. So how do we correlate the postnatal appearance with the prenatal appearance with the postnatal appearance? So here you can see, after 48 hours, if the anteroposterior renal pelvis is 10 to 15 millimeters, there is central calyceal dilatation, but all others are normal, then it is called UTD P1 and it is called as low risk. But after 48 hours, if the AP diameter of the pelvis is greater than 15 millimeters and there is peripheral calyceal dilatation, ureters are abnormal, it is called as intermediate risk. And if it is greater than 15 millimeters, there is parenchymal thickness abnormality, ureters abnormal, bladder abnormal, it is UTD P3 and is called as high risk. So what is it we do? Because in the P1, the voiding cystourethrogram, antibiotics or functional scan is really not recommended, but voiding cystourethrogram and antibiotics is only at the discretion of the clinician. In P2, follow-up is required 1 to 3 months. Again, the discretion is used whether you need to do a voiding cystourethrogram. And again, functional scan, if necessary, it is done. But when you go to P3, the voiding cystourethrogram is recommended, antibiotics are recommended, and functional scan is at the discretion of the clinician. So that is why this classification helps us to classify these people. So the site of obstruction, PUJ versus uretrovesical junction, or lower urinary tract obstruction, which could be PUV or urethral atresia. So let me take you through some case studies to really understand how peculiarly this renal system actually behaves in fetuses. So here's a case 1 of unilateral pelvic junction at 24 weeks. She comes at 26 weeks, you can see a significant dilatation. At 28 weeks unilateral, the liquor is still normal. At 30 weeks, you can see very significant dilatation. Okay, so this, as you see, is slowly increasing, but liquor remain normal. The other kidney is functioning well. Here is a bilateral PUJ obstruction at 20 weeks. The bladder is still small, liquor is normal. At 26 weeks, one side has gone much bigger than the other, and at 32 weeks, the left has become extremely high, whereas the right is still remaining smaller. Bladder is normal, no cyst in the renal cortex. So this also the baby will do reasonably well. So the recommendation in reporting is we look for AP renal pelvis diameter, calyceal dilatation, parenchymal thickness, parenchymal appearance, ureters, bladder, and liquor. We also tell about the specific UTD category for understanding. Right. Now, when you come to uretropelvic junction obstruction, uretroceles are little rare in utero, but when you see, they can be unilateral or bilateral. You can see a typical bladder with an appearance, and when you go up in the kidney, invariably you see a double moiety. You can see the lower moiety dilated, whereas the upper moiety seems to be quite normal. Right. Now, the lower unit tract obstruction is probably the biggest challenge we face in the antenatal period. The most common cause is post-urethral valves, but other less common differential diagnosis are anteurethral valves, urethral atresia, urethral agenesis, and pretecal mass. Now, it will be many times it's difficult to differentiate between urethral atresia and urethral and anteurethral valve and post-urethral valve. So here is a patient who came with us in the first trimester, 11 weeks. Here you can see a huge bladder, and if the bladder is between 7 and 15 millimeters, they have a threefold risk in the risk for aneuploidy. So we go at karyotype, this baby turned out to be a Down syndrome. When the bladder is more than 15 millimeters, we call it as megacystis. We think of obstructive process which could be there. So this is the lower unit tract obstruction with massive increase in the bladder size. You can see a thin wall bladder, and this is classical urethral atresia. Now come to luto, the second and third trimester presentation. Presentation 1 is a male fetus with posterior urethral valve. And here you can see a dilated posterior urethra, distended bladder, bilateral upper tract obstruction. Now what can happen to this? Here you see a high pressure system, and we find in various fetuses, the system behaves very, very peculiarly. Some of them will continue on with a distended bladder and dilated kidney, dilated pelvis, and oligohydramnion over a period of time. Now here you can have bilateral hydrourethral necrosis. Sometimes you can have a spontaneous bladder rupture leading to urinary ascites. And suddenly there's a decompression of the system. The pressure of the system takes care of itself. And sometimes there can be a calyceal rupture causing paranephric urodoma. This happens in about 3 to 17% of cases of post-urethral valves and 7.5% case of urethral obstruction. Now, presentation 2 is here. You can see at 32 weeks, you can see the one kidney was normal, left kidney hydronephrosis, dilated ureter, and 34 weeks, the bilateral hydronephrosis and bilateral dilated ureters, and at 34 weeks, suddenly the bladder became distended. The bladder, which was not very much distended early, suddenly became distended, and posterior urethra was dilated. So a late presentation of post-urethral valve can be seen. And here is another presentation where we can see both kidneys were looking absolutely normal at 20 weeks. Bladder was normal. When she comes at 29 weeks, you can see bilateral dilated kidneys. And at 31 weeks, huge dilatation. It became from A1 to A2, A3. There's huge megacystis and dilated ureters. And at 33 weeks, suddenly the bladder ruptured and urinary ascites, and also a perinephric urodoma has developed. So this kidney, over a period of time, the system ruptured at some point. So the fourth presentation, at 17 weeks, no dilatation of the renal pelvis. Bladder was absolutely normal. And you can see that 21 weeks, the bladder suddenly has become distended, but the kidneys are still normal. And when she comes at 29 weeks, the bladder is hugely distended, but the kidneys are still normal. We have no idea why this pressure has not been transmitted to the upper tract. But at 33 weeks, suddenly the upper tract blows out, and there's a keyhole telling you that this is a post-urethral valve. So this is why counseling these patients become extremely, extremely difficult. So the last presentation is massive urinary ascites, very early rupture of the bladder going on to ascites. And at 30 weeks, you can see a hole in the bladder giving you the ruptured urinary bladder. Right. Now, just to say that urinary ascites in our own series of 20 cases, those who continued to pregnancy, we had normal outcomes with 2, whichever we had. Many of them were for coverage for pregnancy. Now, lower unit tract obstruction. The question is, how are we going to tell the parent that these kidneys will function after birth? Is the renal function preserved? The most important thing is the liquor. If liquor is absent in utero, these kidneys are dead and gone. We are not going to be able to save them. Whatever procedure you do, they are going to have long-term renal problems. So the appearance of the kidneys with echogenic kidneys, cortical cyst, bladder wall thickness, amniotic fluid volume. We can also do urinary, fetal urinary analysis. What we can do is we can do a fetal puncture of the bladder, take some fetal urine, and we send it for sodium chloride osmolality and beta-2 microglobulin. We need to do 3 samples at 48 hours apart so that the old urine is taken away and fresh urine is formed to the baby. And when the urinary beta-2 microglobulin is less than 6 milligrams per liter, there's a favorable outcome. When it's greater than 6 milligrams per liter, it's unfavorable outcome. So a systematic review. So how accurate can we be for prediction of postnatal renal function is Likert volume. The sensitivity is, you can see 0.57, the specificity of 0.84. Amniotic fluid volume, probably one of the most important predictors of postnatal renal function. So whom are we going to intervene and how are we going to save these kidneys? So we have to identify those babies where renal function is still not fully compromised, but is about to be compromised. But we don't want to intervene in patients where renal compromise will not happen on its own. Baby will do on its own. So the interventions which we are thinking of is the vesicoamniotic shunt or fetal cystoscopic fulguration of post-urethral valve. So vesicoamniotic shunt, the issues are the problem in vesicoamniotic shunt is all the shunts which have been done as experimental shunt, where they chose cases where there was severe anhydramnios. These kidneys were already damaged. So they came and said, putting a shunt is of no use because you're not going to survive. So how does shunt help? They said that if you put the shunt, the baby will get Likert, and that Likert will help for lung function and survival of the baby at birth. So putting a prenatal shunt improves survival rates of the baby, but does not improve renal function. And that's an important thing to do. So this was one of the babies with the shunt. We now have a 16-year follow-up for the baby, which is doing quite well because prenatally the function was quite good. Now, the important thing, the shunt is this baby, we did a shunt. The shunt got withdrawn into the peritoneal cavity. So it became a vesicoperitoneal shunt, and fortunately we had to remove it by doing cystoscopically. At 5 years, this baby has a creatinine of 3.4 and it's under treatment. Right. Now, one of the more recent methods of treating post-urethral valve is fetal cystoscopic fulguration of post-urethral valve. So here is a 1 millimeter scope we put into the bladder. We identify the post-urethra. Using a laser 10 watt energy, we can do the renal function. I mean, we can do the fulguration. So this, there's now more and more cases are being done, and they said fetal cystoscopy and vesicoamniotic shunt improve the 6-month survival rate in case of severe luto. Fetal cystoscopy may prevent impairment of renal function in patients with post-urethral valve. Of course, larger studies are needed. So lastly, I'm going to tell you about fetal therapy for urethropy. Prenatal therapy can be given, offered in cases which are developing before fetal mortality in order to prevent severe fetal damage. We can do ultrasound guided percutaneous drainage, laser treatment, or fetoscopic kidney withdrawal for various procedures. So this is a case where we did a bilateral urethropy, where you can see the urethropy in the fetal bladder, and we have done that. So I'll just show you a couple of slides, and then we'll close down. Let me just show you a couple of videos with before that. Can you? Yes. That's the video. Okay, so this is the preparation for the vesicoamniotic shunt. So you can see a double pigtail shunt which we are threading in. One side will be in the bladder and the other side will be in the amniotic. We thread it into a guide wire and we use a 16 gauge needle to thread it inside the fetus. Right? And that is Sega. Then you can see that being threaded inside the bladder. Right? And so once it goes inside, the there. So the shunt is coming into the bladder now. So there. We're just putting a shunt inside, and as we withdraw the needle, one part will be there and the other part will be there. So the success of the shunt will tell you that the bladder will start collapsing and will remain collapsed for the next few days. Right. So that's one. And the other thing I'd like to show you is the fulguration of the erythrocyte. So that is the erythrocyte. I put a small a laser fiber, about 10 watt laser is given. So we can see the erythrocyte collapsing now. Multiple holes are made. And similarly, once this is done, we go to the other one and then we do that. Right. So I will leave you with some messages. Slide. Okay. So CACUT is a spectrum. We need to use standardized terminology so that the antenatal people and the postnatal people they exactly understand what is being said. It can evolve with time. We can be taken by surprise. Many times when postnatally when the baby is born, they ask, oh, they didn't find it out antenatally in the 5th month scan. It should have been found in the 5th month scan. But 5th month scan can be absolutely normal. A Likert is an index of renal function. Always look for associated anomalies. Interventions in very select cases. Long-term outcomes of Luther needs to be understood. And prenatal counseling is very essential. Thank you very much for a patient listening. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suresh. That was a very fascinating view of antenatal ultrasound and sharing these fascinating videos with us. Indeed, it's a thing that we have the opportunity to watch. So we'll go on to the questions. So there's a question from the audience. What is the right gestational age to attempt in utero posterior urethral valve fulguration?
Yeah, it should be ideally done before 26 weeks. Ideally done. The 2 cases which we did it around 27 to 28 weeks because the patient presented at the time. But ideally before 26.
Okay, thank you. Is aneuploidy check a must for all in utero renal anomalies?
No. The aneuploidy check is done only for the 11 to 14 week scan when you do when you see a big bladder. That's the time when we look for aneuploidy. But for routine PUJ obstructions or postnatal valve, we don't do. But the system is, if you are going to do a major procedure for the patient, and if the patient is going to continue the pregnancy, we must ensure there are no other associated abnormalities. Cystic kidneys, polycystic dysplastic kidneys do not require karyotyping because they are not associated with chromosomal abnormality. So renal pelvic dilatation has been associated with trisomy 21, but in a very low association. So it's a part of we put all other parameters because most of the now we've done the first trimester. If for first time screening for Down syndrome and that is low risk, we don't need to karyotype the patient.
Thank you. The last is a compliment which says that your talk was superb. So that's the compliment that must be conveyed to you. Yeah, thank you very much. So, Dr. Prabhu, you seem to have done your job very well, and there seem to be no questions for you from the audience, but I have a question for you. So, there are so many terminologies available. So, and when we are asking for a test,
Yes, ma'am.
we need to be clear about what we are asking for. So, for example, if we have children with steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome, what should I be requesting for? So should I be asking for an NGS? Should I be asking for a clinical exome?
No, there are testing options are too much now. Previously, we didn't have any testing options at all 7-8 years back, and nowadays we have everything at our doorstep. Now the issues with plenty we have, and we don't know what to choose. So purely our phenotypic examination, our filtering of the difference diagnosis is very, very important. That is the homework we have to definitely do. And once we have finalized on what are all the genes we need to see, then what we usually do, in my clinic, what I usually do is, I always get in touch with the labs who does these investigations. So the priority wise, which genes are very, very important for us. I'll ask for the coverage. Each and every time we send a case, I'll ask for the coverage of the gene. Before that, we will look what and all the testing options are there, like sequencing, deletion, duplication. Say the gene is covered about 95% in sequencing and 5% deletion duplication is there. That 5% is also important for me. So what I will ask is, what are all the coverage pattern you will give in this test? And depending on that, depending on the coverage pattern of the testing, we will advise the testing also. There are options available like panel testing, say nephrology panel, they will cover around 30 to 100 genes. So they will have a clinical exome sequencing, which may cover around 4,000 to 5,000 genes. The whole exome sequencing, it may cover around 22,000 pairs of genes. Whole genome almost covers 99% of your genetic material. But the first and foremost is what gene you want to look into and what coverage that lab gives. So one particular gene, if they are giving it a good coverage in nephrology panel, that small panel is enough for us. But if in case we have a big differential list of differential diagnosis or one condition like congenital nephrotic syndrome with so many genes which we may need to choose, then you go on the based on the list they have and the coverage they have. So it purely depends on how much coverage that panel has. Either it can be clinical or whole exome or the nephrology panel. The first priority is your gene which you want to check and how much it is covered in that lab.
So can I chip in here? The most important there are two rules. See, antenatally you have a phenotype. It is very important to accurately diagnose the phenotype. And that phenotype decides what genes that need to be assessed. Now, this is where the challenge comes, because even in the best hands, ultrasound can miss associated anomalies. I think it's isolated, but you may find some subtle anomalies which may not be detected. So that's why you have detailed postnatal evaluation. And if they go for termination, definitely the fetus needs to come for autopsy. There are many cases where after doing renal histology, we have said this is the gene panel that you need to go to. And because you can really identify what it is, otherwise you are stuck in the dark. You send it for a very big gene panel and they'll give you variation of unknown significance. And you don't know whether to apply it to this patient, not apply it to them, become the patient. So that's why accurate phenotypic diagnosis is an absolute must to embark on phenotypic.
Thank you very much. There is a question for you. Recently, it is found that the outcome of fetal therapy for posterior urethral valve does not prevent occurrence of end-stage renal disease. It does prevent pulmonary hypoplasia. And that is because of the poor outcome which can be associated with dysplasia, as you had already commented in your talk. But Dr. Kandaswamy wants further comments from you regarding this.
Yes. So this is very important. See, what has happened is we should understand the posterior, many years ago, almost like 10, 12 years ago, we had a publication along with SRMC pathology department where we looked at 25 cases of kidney PUJ obstructions, which got terminated and came to our fetal pathology unit, and PUV obstruction. And we did renal histology for both. And we found that those who had post-pivotal valves, the nephron number per square micron area was far less in PUVs as compared to PUJs. So primarily, there is something more about PUV which we don't understand. That is, these are even developmentally at a very early stage, the number of nephrons are less. So these kidneys are not going to function optimally as they grow. Now, by doing a vigorous treatment, after all, there are many babies born with PUV and they've been fulgurated postnatally, and they have all been followed. So the spectrum of PUV itself is completely different. The prenatal spectrum, which very severe obstruction with oligohydramnios, these kidneys will not survive. And if you want to do, parents are very keen. This parent which I showed you where he got retracted, that parent 15 years infertility. They said, if the child will live for 1 week after birth, I just want to hold the child in my hand and tell my community that I can actually deliver a baby. That was our goal. So we went ahead and did everything. At 5 years of age, creatinine is 3.4. Now every year the child is living, it's a big bonus for them. And they are very happy about it. But on the other hand, it is well understood that treatment for post-pivotal valve is for improving survival and not improving renal function. This is a well-established thing. So many places they have given up on shunting. But there is a group of patients, people who say, you are doing it too late. So you identify them early. When the liker is still good, go and shunt at that time. So you, whatever is there, you will still preserve it. But we have no biomarkers at this point of time to predict long-term renal function. So we are in a state of equipoise there. That's the problem.
Thank you very much. So I think the bottom line is that fulguration or early management or early shunting is not going to really be able to improve renal function because probably there is already associated hypodysplasia and there are no markers really to identify it, right?
Yes.
I think there are no further questions from the audience. Dr. Pradeep, what is the kind of counseling you do to a patient before you plan a genetic test? So is it, let's say, for example, for a patient of steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome, I'll come back to it because that is what we see most commonly. So do you leave space for the fact that we may not be able to arrive at a diagnosis? And can you discuss some details about counseling because that becomes an important aspect for us?
So we always talk about the need for genetic evaluation. First thing is need for genetic evaluation. What are all the testing options available? And what do you expect from each option? The percentage of coverage, how much percentage you expect from these results, and based on the results, what we are going to do for you. So these are most important factors which the patient also wants to know. So we may tell them that if you are starting up with a lower panel like nephrology panel, which has got a lower coverage, we may need to go ahead, step up the genetic options later on also. So initial counseling will be what is the use and what test I am going to offer for you. You can choose amongst them based on your comfort. But I would advise this one because it has a good coverage. But that doesn't mean we will get the result with this itself. We may need to go ahead, say 90% is the coverage. 9 out of 10 patients, we can get the result and we can act accordingly. 10% of the patient cases, we may get some doubtful results where we may need to reevaluate everything later on also. This is how we initially prepare them for the testing. So we don't tell them everything is ultimate, whatever you're doing is ultimate. We always keep them under follow. we go step by step, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pradeep. And should we wind up for today now? I think we've had a very interesting, fascinating session, very fascinating insights into antenatal ultrasound and what can be achieved by it, and interesting genetic session. Thank you very much. And good
Thanks
night.
a lot. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Suresh sir. Thank you, Jyoti ma'am, Chai, and Pradeep sir. It was an excellent discussion. Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Thanks. Thank you. Bye.